know how to write, and I don't know if I know how to write a novel, but it seems like a young adult novel is sort of what you want to write because you want to speak to people who can still make a change in the world. Our generation having sort of blown it already. So I decided I wanted to write something, and I didn't really know what, but I knew that it was going to have some kind of an environmentalist framework. And then there were these two things that I read right around the same time that both just drilled themselves into my consciousness. One of them was an article in the New York Times, and I don't know if any of you guys remember this. Back in 2011, there was a preacher named Harold Camping who predicted that the world was going to end on like May 23rd. I think that might actually be the date. And there were people all over New York wearing like t-shirts, and they were putting up huge billboards and spending all of their money. And there was this article in the Times about families who were followers of Camping's, where the parents were believers and the children were not, and they were watching their parents, you know, sacrifice their life savings to this man's ideas, and wondering what was going to happen to them. And I read this article and I thought, what happens on May 24th to these families where the parents have lost all credibility, where they no longer have the authority to tell their children to do anything because they've sort of destroyed their lives? What happens to these people? And there wasn't a follow-up article as far as I knew, so I was like, oh, maybe I'll have to write about that. And then there was also this Jared Diamond piece about Easter Island that just fascinated me because it was this perfect microcosm of what we're doing to the planet as a whole. You know, we overpopulate, we use up all the resources, etc. People have actually disputed his theories about what happened on Easter Island, so if any of you are like deep into Easter Island, forgive me. I know that this is not accepted by everyone, but it did seem like this sort of brilliant little distillation of everything we're doing wrong. So these two things were in my head, and then there was sort of the aha moment of, I wonder if there's some way that you could combine those two things and tell a story about it, and that's the genesis of QandA.
And so where did Rooney and her voice come from?
You know, it's been such a long time, I don't know if I have an answer to that. I've never written a book that was my own in this way before. I've written a lot of licensed publishing, and in licensed publishing, like, you have these established characters and you know how they behave, and so then you just put them in a situation and they behave in the way they're going to behave, and you write that. Here, she just seemed to be the person who she needed to be. Like, I knew it needed to be somebody who was a skeptic. Somebody who was not going to be a believer, but who could at least experience a moment of thinking, am I wrong about this? Like, she couldn't be completely, you know, so convinced of her own rightness that there was no room for doubt. I mean, her voice, let's not kid ourselves, she sounds a lot like me. She is not me, but she certainly sounds like me.
Just makes it a little easier to
Yeah.
do that. All right, so again, there are a lot of things that you're tackling in this book. So what was the hardest part to write, and then what was the most fun part to write?
I mean, writing the departure day scene was fun because you could sort of see how everybody was going to play their role, and how each of the people that you had set up would then play out. So I guess there's a little bit of that licensing thing again, like you know who the people are and then they just behave. I also really enjoyed, there's a scene early in the book where Rooney has gone on this sort of recruitment trip. This is where she does the harmonization workshop, and she sits in on this session where this woman is sort of indoctrinating new members of the Next World Society about how to go out into Times Square and talk to people and convince them. And, you know, I've read a certain number of pop psychology books, and so like sort of applying some of that methodology to the way they were teaching. So it's not, you know, they don't come across as wackadoos. They're very much rooted in this idea of what motivates you, because the things that motivate you are also the things that motivate me, and therefore we have this in common, and therefore what I believe is relevant to you. So that stuff was fun to write. I mean, what was the hardest to write? All of it. I mean, it was just effortful. I'm not an easy writer. I'm not somebody who just like doesn't just spill out of me. So it was effort all the way through. But probably some of the scenes with the mother were tough. She's a character who's super different from me, and so I always worried that I was making a stereotype out of her.
Did you always know where it was going to go? And were you writing with an outline? Were you
Yeah, I definitely had an outline. I ended up having to cut a lot of things that were in my original outline because it turned out that I had just crammed it with way too much incident. Like, true story, there was supposed to be this massive hurricane that like wiped out power in New York and flooded it for days, and I wrote that the year before Sandy. And then Sandy came along and I was like, well, it's a good thing that that's not going to fit in the novel because everybody would assume that I was just, reflecting life, but yeah, so there was an outline. I had a sense of where it was going to go. I didn't know exactly what the ending was.
So, but going back to the mother, I mean, I think one of the things you do really well, which I think is a very hard thing to do, especially for a first-time novelist, is that you do grant all of the characters, major or minor, their humanity. That it's very easy, especially when writing from the point of view of a girl who really, because of your plot, can't see people as they truly are because she's so angry at them at some points or in love with them at other, but that you manage that tightrope of sort of, you get her point of view, but you also sort of show the reader that there is more to these people. So I'm curious about how did you sort of get into that, the other heads and not just Ruby's, and especially with the mother. I mean, how did you get to know her to a degree that you could not demonize her and not stereotype her and instead sort of
I mean, so my husband and I met as actors, and he had an acting teacher who said to him, and we both always sort of clung to this because it just seemed so wise, that people don't set out to be bad guys. That people almost always, unless it's Richard III, they don't say, I'm going to be a villain. They say, my beliefs mean that I'm going to behave in this way, and I hope that I can recruit others to my beliefs. And so I don't think that Annalise, the mother, is a bad person, and I don't think that she is trying to do harm. I think she is flawed. And I mean, I don't know, I think it's about empathy, right? And I think the thing about fiction is it's about building empathy. The reason that we read fiction is to sort of understand other people, and then hopefully that allows us to care about other people's points of view. So yeah, I was just empathizing with the characters and sort of thinking, okay, if I were in their shoes, how would I feel?
And you also draw the fault lines in friendships and relationships pretty well. I mean, were you drawing on your own experience, or were you drawing on observation? I mean, what other characters sort of felt the strongest to you?
I don't think that there was much drawing on my own experience. I think that this was mostly, again, about, like, I knew what the situation was going to be, and so then I knew who the people needed to be. I don't know if I have a smart answer to that question, David.
That's right. I'm curious about the acting thing and how that influenced. I mean, would you read it aloud as you were writing or when you were done?
Yeah, sometimes. There are some characters in particular that I always had this urge to read out loud, and some of them I probably had no business reading out loud. But yeah, I do think that the way people sound is the primary thing I'm thinking about when I'm writing. Like, I'm not good at plot, but I'm pretty good at voice, and so the way each character sounded, like, it had to feel natural in your mouth. It had to feel like something somebody would actually say. So I think that's always the root of what I'm trying to produce.
All right, the question I warned you about, because it's not necessarily the question, but since we're here, it's November 1st.
It's November 1st.
So the obvious
November came.
question I have to say exactly is, so why pick on November? I mean, like, you had 12 choices. Why is November bringing on the end of the world?
Okay, so first of all, look at how beautiful it is.
Yeah.
Like, it has this quality of melancholy about it, but it also, like, for me, November is very much the two sides of that coin. It is a time when the world is kind of going into this little death, if I may, but there's also these great family celebrations that are taking place. I happen to really love Thanksgiving. That's my holiday because I don't do Christmas, and you guys know. I'm sorry. But Thanksgiving is the one that has always really meant something to me, and so the duality of that was important. But if I'm going to be really honest, it was logistical. Like, I knew that I had to have this arc take place over the course of the school year, and if I was going to get to that by June, then I had to get departure day to happen more or less in this time frame, and I wanted to happen before Thanksgiving because there were things around Thanksgiving that needed to happen. So I a little bit arbitrarily picked the 17th of November, and then after I had written the whole thing and like chosen all the dates from it was actually a 2017 calendar when I started writing this in 2011. I mentioned to a friend of mine who is of Greek origin that the departure happens on November 17th, and she went, and I said, what? And she said, oh, November 17th is really not a good day in Greece. So apparently there's like a revolutionary organization that had, there was a big bad thing that happened on November 17th. So, if this gets published in Greece, I apologize. It wasn't deliberate. November.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, then open it up, which is my way of prompting you to have your questions ready, because nobody likes that awkward moment when I ask for questions, you guys stare at us, we stare at you. It's really nobody enjoys that. So people are going to raise hands when I ask.